Hi everybody! Last year I taught a class on adaptation. We studied a variety of texts and how they were adapted from page to screen. And one of the reasons I really wanted to teach this class was because I really notice in English classrooms a common attitude that I wanted to challenge about films and adaptations more specifically. A lot of English students have the idea that the book is always better than the movie. I'm sure you have heard that phrase a number of different times. And since I come from a film background, I really took offense to this notion because I think underneath it all is this idea that films are not complete objects on their own, that rather they are taking a novel and truncating it, and as a result are just mere summaries of a novel, so that anything that they can't manage to fit into that movie is a failure on their part. Usually this kind of thinking stems from the idea that books are a higher art form than film. That has been an idea that has circulated around the Academy since the beginning of film, and that's just something that new art forms generally have to contend with, including novels. When novels were new, they had the same kind of poor reputation as being for the masses, for the popular masses. So there is this idea that literature, like big L literature, is far more worth our study because it is more complex and more interesting, and I just don't believe that at all. I see these same kind of ideas floating around the bookish internet too. I see it on common book websites, this idea that the book is always better than the movie, and actually on BookTube I've run into a lot more interesting videos about adaptation where people are actually considering the particularities of form in a much more nuanced way. So I wanted to add to that conversation by creating a series of videos that add to that conversation about adaptation. Perhaps taking a small slice of particularities of adaptation and using examples to illustrate them. Today I want to talk a little bit about interiority and narrative in adaptation, and I am going to do so through the lens of the new film and novel Room by Emma Donoghue. I think the main problem with the common response to film adaptations is that people are privileging narrative over form. They're thinking about what composes the story, settings, characters, sequentiality, those sorts of things, instead of thinking about the actual pieces that make up that story. And yes, all of those components of narrative help to create meaning, but also essential to creating meaning is the form of the project itself. And since the form of films and books are so completely different, it actually doesn't make a whole lot of sense to compare them on an evaluative basis. Now, I understand that you can say, I enjoyed the process of watching this movie more than I enjoyed the process of reading this book. That can happen and that's valid, but that's more about your enjoyment and not about the actual object itself, right? So to say something like, this was better, like The Revenant film was better than The Revenant the book, it doesn't really make much sense. Imagine it in different mediums. So like if you were comparing Romeo and Juliet, the written play, to Romeo and Juliet, the performance, okay, maybe you can compare those, and then you're comparing that to Romeo and Juliet, the opera, and then maybe a painting representation of Romeo and Juliet. It starts to not really make a lot of sense. How do you say what's better, an opera or a painting? They're just completely different mediums, right? And so even though both film and novels are working with narrative in a sequential pattern that gives us the idea that they can be compared evaluatively like that, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. One of the ways that films and novels are completely different is in the way that they convey interiority. Books, because they are linguistic, can offer the reader access into a character's mind constantly, and at least into a narrator's mind. It doesn't have to be an omniscient narrator. You are always getting something from the perspective of a narrator, right? So that offers a certain kind of interiority in a way that films can't do because they combine the visual and the verbal without the linguistic. So in films, we do not have that kind of precise access to inside a character's mind. So instead, films have to use different ways of conveying interiority of characters, and that can be through all the building blocks of the form, like cinematography, editing, production design, acting, music. All of these different things that make up the film can help us sense the interiority of a certain character. So I want to think a little bit about Room specifically and how the two different forms of the story both look at interiority very differently. And this example is really interesting because both the novel and the film were written by Emma Donoghue, so she still had some authorial control over how the adaptation developed. The book is told from the perspective of a 5-year-old boy named Jack. He has grown up in this single room and has never seen the outside world, and so to him that room is completely natural. There's nothing weird about that room to him, so he doesn't experience anything in his life as traumatic. To him that is just normal. It's completely naturalized. He also talks about the objects in the room as a 5-year-old might. Some people have had issues with this in the book. I thought it was quite clever to name certain objects in the room and to give them a kind of personality, as though the child has a little bit of a community, even though him and his mom, the novel names her Ma, although they are so isolated, he still has like a group of objects to care for. And he's stuck in this room with Ma, and he experiences her through his perspective, so we as readers, situated in his first-person narrative, experience her through Jack's perspective as well. And just like a child would, other people are not quite distinguished from him. So when he perceives his mother, it's almost like she is an extension of himself. He doesn't really know that there is a complete difference in the way that they see the world. He doesn't have that existential isolation that we talk about sometimes. So this first-person narration does not only give us Jack's point of view, but it also erases Ma's point of view. Her point of view is sort of subsumed under Jack's POV, and we see everything through his lens. Now the film could have tried to mimic this narrative style. There are a lot of ways, as I said, that film can try to grasp interiority and situate you with a certain character. But she does a really interesting thing in the film where she opens the lens of perspective and we see things from multiple characters' point of views. They could have done this a number of ways in the film, but I want to focus here on editing because I think that it really illustrates the point I'm trying to make about how the film form as a separate form can create interiority even though it doesn't have linguistic access into somebody's brain. There was a Russian filmmaker named Lev Kuleshov who conducted a very famous experiment. He filmed an old man, just like from here up, and the old man has a very just stern looking face, just and he would show that image and then he would juxtapose it with another image, and it would be maybe a plate of food, or it would be a a picture of children playing, or it would be a picture of a coffin. And when he showed it to people, when he showed the man's face stern, and then let's say the picture of the food, people would say, "Oh, I think that this man is hungry." Or he'd show the man's face, exact same face, stern, right? How many times do I need to do this? And then he would show it with the picture of the children playing, and they would say, "Oh, he's very happy." Or he'd show the exact same thing, show the funeral, and people would think that he was grieving. So even though this image stayed the same of the man, when he juxtaposed it with other images, people would naturally combine those two meanings together, and in that space between the frames, they would craft an entirely new meaning, a third meaning. And this became very important to all sorts of Russian filmmakers who were trying to make propagandistic films, but it also became important to filmmakers everywhere. How do you edit images together to guide the audience where you want them to go? And when you combined those editing techniques with certain cinematography techniques, you could create an interior space that your audience can enter into and see things from a character's point of view, right? Because when they showed the man stern and then they would juxtapose it with the plate of food, the audience imagined that he was looking at the food, and so we imagined his interior space. As an example of how Room opens up that perspective to both of its main characters, I have a little clip that I'm going to play now.
Do you remember how Alice wasn't always in Wonderland?
She fell down, down, down deep in a hole.
Right, well, I wasn't always in Room. I'm like Alice. I was a little girl named Joy.
Nah.
And I lived in a house with my mom and my dad. You would call them Grandma and Grandpa.
What house?
A house. It was in the world. And there was a backyard, and we had a hammock. We would swing in the hammock, and we would eat ice cream.
A TV house?
No, Jack, a real house, not TV. Are you even listening to me? When I was a little older, when I was 17, I was walking home from school.
Where was I?
You were still up in heaven. But there was a guy, he pretended that his dog was sick.
What guy?
Old Nick. We call him Old Nick. I don't know what his real name is. but he pretended his dog was sick.
What's the dog's name?
Jack, there wasn't a dog. He was trying to trick me, okay? There wasn't a dog. Old Nick stole me.
I want a different story.
No, this is the story that you get. He put me in his garden shed. Here, room is the shed.
So in that clip, you can notice the way that the perspective changes as they edit through the shot reverse shot, right? To mimic a conversation not only from Jack's point of view, which they could have done, him just looking up at Ma, him looking at other things in the scene. They could have situated us firmly with Jack, but instead they also show things from Ma's point of view, so we see the camera looking down as though she is looking at Jack. And in that way, we can experience how Ma's seeing this explanation, an extremely frustrating and dire situation for her, and how Jack's seeing it, which is confusing, and he feels lied to, I think. It's just completely beyond what he can possibly imagine. So it seems to me that Donoghue took this opportunity of adapting her book to screen to explore an entirely new interior space. It's still the same story, the plot structure unfolds in the same way, and in that way we might talk about it being true to the novel. But in other ways it's completely untrue to the novel, because no longer is Ma erased, but she is a distinct person in this movie. And that's one of the reasons that I think that Brie Larson could be nominated for an Oscar for this. If it was all from Jack's point of view and she was a mere extension of Jack, then she couldn't be a character in her own right. And as a result, I think that we actually identify more with Ma in this film than with Jack. Now I know that that's a subjective experience and that people might not totally agree with me, but as an adult going to the theater and somebody who is very near to Brie Larson in age, I felt like I could see things from her perspective a lot easier than I could see things from Jack's perspective. And that's what made this adaptation really interesting to me. Not that it overshadowed the book in any way, because like I said, I think those two forms are completely different, but that it added to the story in very interesting ways. And if you watch the film or you read the book on their own without putting them together, they work on their own, but if you put them together, it's almost like the story is additive. It's like completely expanded into a whole new place. So that is my first video on adaptation. I will have more to say on the subject. I'm very, very interested in how different texts are adapted to film, and I would love to hear what you had to say. How did you feel about the movie Room? I would love to hear from people who had read the book before they saw the movie, but I would also actually like to hear from people who maybe saw the movie and then read the book, or have only seen the movie or have only read the book. I think that reader experience plays a huge part in how we see the two different stories, so please leave me your comments and we can talk further about this.